Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, let's find out. Wes Bleed is a media producer and podcaster. He recently retired as Marketing and Communications Director for the Water Quality Association, a trade association for the water treatment industry. For nearly 30 years, Wes was a broadcast journalist and served as a news director for WGN Radio in Chicago. He later transitioned to public relations and marketing, and he's a 1980 grad from Wheaton College. And from my perspective, most importantly, Wes and I played football together for a few years.
That is the most important thing. Yes.
So Wes, I must admit, it's intimidating to interview somebody who was in the news business for many years and who was a former voice-over artist. What exactly is that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. Great honor to be with you. And voiceover artist, kind of an interesting way of making a living, right? It's really the person who is narrating that audiobook you're listening to in the car.
Oh.
It's the person who's doing the commercial that you're hearing, which may be a character voice or could be just a regular narration voice. Somebody who says something as simple as "member FDIC" to, something else about whatever they want you to learn or understand. So a voiceover artist can take and wear many hats, but it's generally that idea that you're using your voice for some kind of communication effort.
Help refresh my memory. What was your major here?
Speech communication.
Perfect sense. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that makes sense. And as I recall, we only had two of our classmates out of about 600 who went into any type of journalism. We had one of our female classmates was in local television for a while. But I think you're the only one who spent a career in the radio business. Is that correct?
As far as I know, I think you're right. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's remarkable. That begs the question, how did you initially get into the news business?
I got into radio just after high school, and I worked at a small Christian station in my hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And then that got me interested in the college radio station and the speech communication department and so on and so forth. And it was during college and during the different courses I was taking that more and more I was kind of being drawn to that news journalism thing. And that was the angle I wanted to pursue. Other people get into broadcasting and they want to be a talk show host, or they want to be a disc jockey, or they want to be a salesperson or a general manager. I tended to think that news was where I wanted to go. That seemed kind of aligned well with my interests. And because, sort of like you, David, we had interest in, social studies and politics and
right.
foreign policy and international relations and all of those kinds of things.
Which is clearly where my career took me, although I thought I was going to be a political science major here, and it just never worked out. I went to history and never looked back. But having said that, you got a great voice. If I was self-critical, which I am occasionally, I would say I wish I had a radio voice and a television face.
So I'm telling you, in all seriousness, and for anybody listening who thinks, oh yeah, I don't have a voice to do like a podcast or to be on the radio. Well, these days, first of all, everybody's much more forgiving of anybody who's in the media. And so you'll hear people like sportscasters and whatnot on doing baseball games and so forth. And I listen to the types of broadcasters out there, and they're very good, but they don't have the voice of the previous generation of broadcasters. You don't have to have that big booming authoritative voice anymore. I think there's a certain amount of everyday element that people like. At the same time, you still have to be fairly articulate. You still have to be
Well,
able to
and
say words that
understandable.
people, yeah, and people can hear you and understand you. But that quality of the voice doesn't necessarily have to be the professional radio announcer, that sort of thing.
Interesting. Well, do you think it helped your career that you came from the Midwest?
Yes, definitely. That has always been held out as sort of the broadcaster accent, if you want to call it that. Now, there are different variations of that Midwest accent. And to some extent, I had to kind of work through what I found to be a downside to my accent from Northern Illinois. I
Hmm.
mean, I could pick up some things that I used to say. It was very easy for me to kind of get a little nasally on certain words, as an
Yes.
example. And in Chicago, you hear a lot of Chicagoese, and that if you're not careful, people will have in their voice, and so you have to watch that, I guess. But no, the Southern accent is not the traditional broadcaster. The Eastern accent is not the traditional broadcaster, although you hear them and they're fine. In fact, some people, they, especially if you're more on, let's just say, a columnist or an opinion person or commentator side of things, you can be much more engaging because you do have a little bit of an accent or a dialect.
I'm wondering if
So,
that's considered more authentic if you sound like Howard Cosell or for somebody from the South, for example.
right. Yeah, it could be. Could
Well,
be.
let me ask you this. How would you say the business has changed over the years? Because you have a 30-year slice and then you went private sector for a few years after that, but
Mhm.
you got a good horizontal look at your profession.
Well, the news business overall has been a great example of disruption
Mm.
and complete revolution that's gone on over the last 20, 25 years. You had the emerging internet, which disrupted the model, the business model
Right.
of the newspapers and TV stations. They had a stranglehold on all of the advertising revenue. And all of a sudden, along comes the internet and just knocks that completely over. And so you've seen the decline and the demise of the traditional newspaper.
Right.
You also had the rise of technology, which allowed people to read the news on their phones and laptops and iPads and everything else that have come along in the last 15 to 20 years. So you have no need to print as many newspapers. So there was the news, and then there was the newspaper, the paper aspect of it, which was totally changed. The
Mm.
revenue, as I said, that the whole business model, you didn't need the classified ads, you didn't need you didn't have to
Mm.
just sell your car in the Tribune in Chicago. You had many other options to use, and so therefore all of that revenue went away. Massive layoffs occurred,
Right.
massive numbers of newspapers closed,
Yeah.
a bunch of people got laid off and looked for other opportunities in the media. And there were some, clearly things moved online. And then there were some new online elements. But then a lot of the news was, people were getting from Facebook and
Mm.
other social media sites. And we tended to just sort of pick up the headlines and get a snippet or two here or there. And so that was how we consumed media. And
Right.
and
One of the
news.
questions that I ask my students, Wes, is where do you get your news from? And you'll be happy to hear that most of them get it from traditional vetted journalistic sources like newspapers or the BBC or things like that nature. Occasionally, I'll have somebody say X or some social or Twitter
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I think they realize even that it's not as reliable, and the opinion aspect has kind of overtaken the news aspect. And I'll tell them, look, I like the Associated Press because I tend to trust news sources that have a lot of nouns and very few adjectives or adverbs. And the Associated Press, basically, it's like the old dragnet line, just the facts, ma'am. And I really like that. Not everyone does. Some people like to hear the spin. What's your thought on that?
I tend to agree more with you on that. I think that's a great way of putting it. I like that. I think I might have to use that sometime if
Feel
I'm
free.
in another conversation. A little more nouns and fewer adjectives, or action verbs, I guess, would be
Yes.
okay, right? He
Yes.
did. He did. He said. She said.
Right.
He approved. They approved. Whatever.
But
But
adverbs are not your friends necessarily.
right. However, having said that,
Mhm.
one of the things that we do get, and then I went through a transition with and I'll just say with Fox News as an example.
Mhm.
I
Sure.
wanted nothing to do with Fox News when I
Mhm.
was in journalism. I thought that they, and I will also admit this, I didn't give them much of a chance. So after I left WGN, um, occasionally I'd land on it and start to consume it. And little by little, at 2013, 2014, 2015, I was watching it more and more. And I really liked it for the columnists and the pundits they had
Mhm.
on.
Mhm. Mhm.
I wasn't looking for it for straight news because I understood what they were trying to do, which was, and this is another element to the whole dialogue about the news business changing, which was they figured out that there was room for a conservative approach to news, which it didn't mean the news was different. It just meant they were adding their perspective. And so I started to appreciate the fact that there was some commentary and whatnot on that, and I began to understand it a little bit better, and I began to appreciate a little bit more what they offered. Now that started to go downhill again around 2020,
Yeah.
2021, and I actually have not been back in the last few years to Fox News, other than occasionally.
Interesting.
But so my choices, my feelings about the media kind of ebb and flow, and my sense is that there's going to continue to be changes,
Mhm.
and I can't even guess as to where we'll wind
No,
up in another 5 to 10 years.
no, I think that that's great. And I'm going to ask you a question that I think I know the answer to, but I need you to tell me. What's a
Yep.
news director? What does a news director do?
Good question. News director is the title I had as I was in charge of the news department at WGN Radio. And it was the person who said, okay, you got a budget, you've got so many staff people, you've got to put that staff together in such a way that you've got your anchors who are delivering the news, you've got your people who are reporters who are out chasing the news and writing the news and producing the news. And so you're pretty much managing a department like you would manage a sales department or a marketing department.
Okay.
You're not orchestrating the news. You're not deciding what the news is per se, although you're leading a vision. You're putting a vision out there in terms of what the department is all about, but you're coaching, you're correcting, you're leading in the sense that you're saying, hey, we want to be first with that story, and we want to make sure we're holding up our standards.
Right.
And if something happened where maybe that didn't occur, then you'd want to address that with that staff person or whatever that might be.
Hmm. So one of the things I've learned in law school, I learned a lot, but that the purpose of a trial was to find the truth. There was a search for the truth. Is there a similar saying in the news world that you put things out and catchy phrase? What's that catchy phrase, if there is one?
Well, there are a lot of little catchy phrases I can recall. I don't know that there's one that is exactly that, what you had just said, a search for the truth. But there was one, for example, that said, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Um, the idea being kind of similar, right? In that,
Right.
don't just assume that the sky is blue. Make sure you stick your head outside and check.
Right.
Um, your mother says she loves you. Well, okay, let's go ahead and double check.
That
The
makes you think, that makes you think of what President Reagan was quoted as saying. trust but verify. I don't know if you came up with it, but it's a great way to kind of summarize that train of thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And another one was that news is the first rough draft of history.
Hmm.
So you're a history major.
Yes.
Now, you know that things that are written generations later, when there's more time and the dust has settled and people have had various sources and things that they've been able to compile and pour through, they get a better perspective on what happened than the people who were in the immediate dust up of whatever happened.
Right. Right.
And I think that is true for news. So you're out there covering the news, but it's not the whole story. It's only what you know today. So the
Right.
search for the truth is, yeah, you're searching for the truth, but there's no way you can know the whole story.
At least not immediately,
Yeah.
contemporaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a strong argument for why did it take the biblical canon so long to be written? Because it wasn't until 325 that the Council of Nicaea said, here is canon scripture, and the rest, it's not canon. So it doesn't have the same indicia of reliability. Because one of the things I learned, again, trying cases, was eyewitnesses get it wrong sometimes. A lot of times they get it wrong. Or you asked 4 eyewitnesses who saw the car crash what they saw, and they're going to have 4 different stories. So what's the truth?
Yeah. It goes back to that again. Yeah.
Exactly.
One person looking at the accident says, well, and then the fire broke out. And the other person says, what fire? And
Or that
so
wasn't
there's
a
all,
fire, that was a spark, or
yeah.
whatever they remember. Well,
Well, that's a
what
great.
about this?
I love your point though about the canon, and
Yeah.
I've used that in speaking about, like for example, our New Testament
Yes.
writers, like the gospel writers. Okay,
Right.
you've got Matthew and Luke and Mark and John. They didn't all say the same thing because they didn't all see the same thing, or they had their own unique perspective on it,
Well,
and
that's right.
it took some time to put together.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, they're remarkably similar, but they're not identical.
Yeah.
And that's an indicia of unreliability if you get 2 eyewitnesses who will parrot the exact same line. And you wonder, well, were they coached? Did they agree on this? I mean,
Yeah.
there's the trial process really tends to discredit exact remembrances from different people, from different perspectives.
So here's another saying that I remember too from some of the quotes around media. Nothing is ever as good or as bad
Hmm,
as first reported.
that's good. I
How
like
about
that.
that?
Yeah, no, I like that a lot.
We tend to overreact to everything, and we say this is the worst thing in the world or this is the greatest thing in the world, and chances are it's not
No.
either one.
No, and that struck me during the riots and protests after George Floyd, people saying this is the worst it's ever been since the Civil War. And I thought, no, I mean, I remember the Vietnam era. I was a kid like you were, and I remember
Yeah.
much worse protests and riots and cities burning in the late 60s,
Right.
and I'll tell my students that, saying, well, it's not great, but it was worse in my lifetime, so relax. It's going to get better. What about this phrase, Wes? Um, I've heard some journalists say they want to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. True
Mm-hmm.
or untrue?
I think there's certainly an element of that, but I think my perspective was when I was in the news business, I didn't really think of it that way. I just wanted to make sure people were informed.
Hmm, that's good.
So if I could tell somebody what was going on, is there something in the world they needed to know about? Something going on in the world, in the Middle East, whatever, that would be important. I wanted to make sure they knew that. Is there something going on in the country that they needed to know about? An election, a new initiative in Congress. Is there something that people should know about in their own state
Mhm.
and in their town? So I was largely a information type of approach. There were others who had certainly a gift of investigative journalism where they were unearthing things that needed to be told and they were shining a light on things that needed to be exposed. I don't know if it was just my perspective, my perspective, my personality, my approach, or if it was, I wasn't as good as some of
Right,
those other
right.
people. But that's kind of how I saw it.
Looking back on your career, what would you say was the biggest story you covered as a reporter?
Yeah, pretty much everything was local. So there wasn't any great big story. In Chicago, we had a few here and there. I mean, there was the big Chicago flood that
Yeah,
people who are listening might remember, 1992, I want to say, where they had the Chicago River that was actually flooding the underground tunnels around the city. And it was one of those things that if you were looking above ground, you would not have known that there was this
right.
catastrophe going on beneath the surface. Um, and then other comings and goings of mayors and governors and all of that. So there wasn't any single one story that I can remember, but
That's
uh,
fair.
and again, it was all kind of exciting to be involved. Now on 9/11, I remember that we were all trying to look for a certain angle of what we could do to kind of bring the story to Chicago, because the focus was on New York and DC.
Mhm.
But so what I ended up doing was just kind of walking up and down Michigan Avenue, and I'd see people talking, and you could see people making motions with their hand. You could tell that they were talking about the World Trade Center. And then I went into Fourth Pres downtown on Michigan Avenue, and covered part of a prayer service that was going on, and
Right.
just reminding people that at this type of event, this major situation, that people were still thinking about their faith and God, and
Mhm, mhm.
it was important to remember that as well.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is how your Christian faith has affected your news career.
Yeah, I think in two ways. I think I did look for those opportunities on occasion when it would seem appropriate to bring in. So, um, hey, there's a certain amount of there's a certain opportunity to bring somebody's faith,
Right.
of what their story was. Did it matter? Was it part of the story? Well, I would try to do that. The other one was, obviously, I wanted to be accurate and fair and truthful in everything I covered. So
Right.
I would make sure that I was trying to set an example from that standpoint. I wasn't trying to, be out on the edge with some controversial approach to covering the news, whether or not it was true. I just wanted to make sure I had people listening. No, that was not my approach.
Right. Right.
And
Good.
um,
Good.
and in addition, I did do things that I thought tended to touch on maybe uh, uh, I didn't lie to get my information. I wouldn't call somebody up and pose as if I were somebody else. I might not necessarily say who I was exactly,
Right.
but I didn't want to cross that line either. So there were some elements that I was trying to hold myself to a high standard.
Good. Good. Yeah, I've heard a lot of criticism of the journalist world, and I don't buy all of it. I've got a lot of friends in the business, and I'm sure you know that a lot of Wheaton grads go into journalism now, from the Washington Post to local news outlets. What advice would you give them? We'll say it's someone who's just beginning, somebody's got just maybe a couple of years, a couple of months of experience, based on your 30 plus years of experience.
Well, the advice, I guess, is to, if you really feel like you're called to do it and this is where you should be, then to do again the things that require you to be above board, be looking for that truth, doing it in the right way,
Right.
treating everybody with dignity and respect,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and bringing all of that to bear. In other words, just doing a great job,
Right.
and making sure people are served with the information. And then I would say that to be aware, if you're just starting out, that the business is going to continue to evolve. So um, you want to be kind of what did we used to call the fullback who had that they needed to have their head on a swivel,
Yes, that's right.
because they would never know where the defender was coming from that they had to block. And
Right.
so you have to have your head on a swivel, I think, in the media, because things are going to change so quickly. You just don't know where the next change is coming from. So have that head on a swivel, be ready to ebb and flow with the changes.
And there's a possibility that a listener may not know what a fullback is because that position,
That's true.
that position is not used very much anymore. But there used to be back in the day a position of a running back behind the quarterback. So it was center, quarterback, fullback, and then running backs. And now you don't see the fullback position even filled much anymore, just once in every long while. But they're primarily blocking backs and not running backs, in my memory.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. Would you do it again, looking back on your career? Would you go back into the news business?
I think so. I think I might have would have been open more quickly to other changing dynamics, and maybe I would have done. How can I say this? I would have segmented my career up into different groups. So I would have
Mhm.
maybe done 5 years of this and
Mhm.
7 years of that, and tried to maneuver, not maneuver, but be ready to move into another situation or position earlier than I did.
Interesting.
So I ended up getting fired, from WGN because
It makes two of
management
us.
changed.
So you're a good
Yeah.
guy.
and and I looked at it at the time was this, I walked around for the longest time feeling shame and
Mhm.
feeling, failure and all of those typical
Right.
things that
Right.
you would think. I look back on it now and think that it was a great thing because
Amen.
it forced me to move and pivot and move into something else.
Amen.
But I would have done that earlier on my own, I think.
One of my favorite public speaking topics is the value of failure and how God uses failure to really bless us. And I'll tell you, being fired as U.S. attorney was at the time extremely painful and embarrassing and humiliating. But now, in the hindsight, looking back 15 plus years, it's one of the best things that happened to me professionally and personally. And I'm talking to you today because I got fired. Otherwise, I'd probably be at some political position in New Mexico or Washington, D.C. Let me ask you this. What is your favorite scripture verse and why?
I have two.
Okay.
Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Well, those are two verses right there, but let's call those one. So Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord
Okay.
with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding.
Mm.
In all your ways, acknowledge him and he will direct your paths, or he will make your path straight. That's always been one that I have held close. I believe it strongly, feel it is the kind of a life verse
Yeah.
to keep you focused on what's important, making sure that you're realizing that God is the one who is leading and guiding. The other one is more from a theological standpoint. Romans 8:1, there is therefore now no condemnation
Mm.
for those who are in Christ Jesus. So this whole idea that I'm not, I was on death row, I was condemned,
Yeah.
I'm not anymore. And it's all because of Christ Jesus. So that's the, greatest news anybody could ever have.
That's wonderful. And the term evangelical has kind of been drug into disrepute, but originally it was picked because it was sharing of the good news. And the good
Yeah.
news is the message of Christ, salvation and whatnot. So as evangelicals, we were supposed to spread the good news, which
Yeah.
fits in well with what you were doing. So let me ask you this. What makes, only I'll have a couple more questions, but this is kind of a big one. So think about the answer. What makes something newsworthy? And let me give you a story. I won a big case in Albuquerque in which um, we went to trial. It involved a police officer who injured someone pretty badly. And we could have been, um, I don't know, we could have lost millions of dollars, but the jury went with my client, found zero liability. So my boss called the local newspaper and said, I'd like you to run a story. And they said, well, that's not news. He says, well, what's news? He goes, let me give you an example. It's not news when the airliner lands safely at the airport, but when it crashes, that's news.
Mm-hmm.
So that was his definition back then. That was 30 plus years ago. You've been in the business, I haven't. What makes something newsworthy?
Well, there's a fair amount of truth to what he said. And the idea is that you don't want to bother people or take up somebody's time with information that really hasn't changed since yesterday or last week or last month. Again, the train's running on time. Do we need to say that today? Or do we want to tell you that the trains are delayed, that there's a train that's not running this morning that you're going to try to catch to head downtown? It's not running, so you better take another form of transportation. Isn't that more informative than just all of the trains that are running? So there's a healthy amount of truth to what he was saying. I think sometimes we tend to forget that there are a whole lot of different perspectives in our community, or in, among listeners, readers, and so forth, to whom a particular story may mean a lot. It may not have much significance at all. A local teacher strike is going to affect the parents and the teachers and all of the people involved in putting school together on a given day, much more so than let's face it, than the retired couple down the street. They
Right.
may not be as focused or as interested. There might be interest, but it's not they're not hanging on every word, right?
That's right.
The stories that we have kind of devolved into, that media get the most criticism for, is if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
The accidents, the murders, the mayhem, all of that tends to get our attention. But in the end, are those stories really that important? Well, probably somewhat important, in the sense that, hey, does your community have a problem?
Right.
Is there a crime problem? Are the politicians addressing it? Is there policy change that needs to be made, et cetera, et cetera? So you just have to keep in mind that news is a certain element of what is new and different, and also what is touching the most people.
That's good. All right. Final
Yeah.
question. Is
Okay.
there any question I did not ask you that I should have?
Well, it's probably more of a media question, and that is, what's the next big thing?
That's good.
And
Okay.
and right now, I think this AI, ChatGPT, it is huge. It is so huge that I can't even begin to think about all the different elements that are going to play out because of it. I think that it's like a lot of what we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years is like electricity at its beginning, where people first saw that you could power light. You could turn on a light bulb.
Right.
And then over time, they figured out, well, you know what? I can make an electric motor, and I can make an electric vacuum cleaner, and an electric iron, and so
Washing
on.
machine.
And everything just kind of boomed from
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
Whole new economies were made.
that's true.
And so I think this Chat GPT and AI and everything else has that potential.
Well, that's a really positive way of looking at it. So I want to thank you, Wes, for your time, and wish you blessings on you and your family. Thank you so much.
David, thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye now.
Take care.
You have been listening to Wheaton's Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics podcast. 3 Things with host David Iglesias. Join us again in 2 weeks for a new interview with an accomplished faith, political, and business leader.